Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died. And they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Edit. Unfortunately, this is all the information I know on this story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. This reminds me of a guy in Florida that was picking up dead iguanas. It had gotten so cold they would fall out of the trees dead. Except they weren't dead and sprung back to life as they warmed up in his car. He crashed but was fine. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix. And it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. 6 months after my aunt's passing in a drunk driving incident, the coroner decided to ring up my mum and inform her that they completed their report on her passing, and deemed the likelihood of suicidal intentions which may have factored into said incident. I initially didn't understand how coroners could deduce such a thing. Until I remembered. Self-harm scars are a thing. My mum had only just gotten to the acceptance stage of grief. And it put her firmly back to square one. She's fine now. So I'm not an autopsy doctor or anything of the sort. I did sit in on a murder trial. The mom drowned her infant in hot water. She claimed she was giving her newborn a bath in the sink with one of those sling-type inserts so babies can't go under. The doorbell rang. She answered and came back to her kid in scalding hot water. She claimed the kid had somehow turned on the hot water and burned himself while she was answering the door. But drowning was the ultimate rule of death. In the autopsy photos, the most disturbing thing I've ever seen in real life is you could clearly make out hand marks on that poor child's skin. On his biceps. You could see the finger outlines like you do if someone slaps you. I was 18 years old taking a criminal justice class. Just the ease of watching the trail and her nonchalance killed most faith I had in humanity at the time. I know this doesn't quite fit the question, but for years I saw that boy's face in my sleep. What really kills me is despite the evidence she got off. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle. And the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing. So we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in. But we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all. And the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. As a student in the medical field, I had the opportunity to visit a cadaver lab. I was very surprised to see how many people had died from choking. Out of the 12 or so cadavers in the lab that day, at least 7 or 8 were from choking. I went home and immediately looked up how to perform self-Heimlich. During medical school I did a forensic pathology rotation during 4th year. Had an autopsy on a woman found in her burned out home. She was on home oxygen and the fire started in her bedroom. There were also liquor bottles around the home. So the thought was maybe she was drunk, smoking in bed, and caught herself on fire. She was badly charred up on the outside with no real distinguishing characteristics I could see. We opened her up and when we got to her lungs they were just the prettiest pink you could imagine. Just like in the textbooks. This means she wasn't alive to breathe in the smoke and soot from the fire, so she had died. Spoiler. Was murdered before it was said. Ultimately I read in the paper some weeks later it was the boyfriend trying to get insurance money. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs. Dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom. Giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I was an investigator for a state medical examiner for just over 2 years. Had a mom that had drank herself to death according to the husband after relapsing on Mother's Day weekend. I just felt like something was off. Sent her for an autopsy. Had a ruptured liver where dude had essentially beat her till she internally bled to death. Later, while out on bail, he stole a semi-truck, crashed it in a pond, got out shooting at a deputy, and they killed him. Saved the taxpayers a good chunk of money. Former homicide detective here. Suspicious death. 30-ish male found alone by cleaning staff in the back row of a sparsely attended sci-fi movie. Strange scratching wounds around / in mouth. Some petechiae in eyes and on cheeks. But no signs of strangulation. No obvious signs of chronic illness or disease. Presented as healthy. Normal adult male. Found on his person was a wallet with normal contents. And a single cancelled movie ticket. Indicating he went alone. Weird. Spy movie speep going on here. Autopsy. A large amount of popcorn compacted in his esophagus. Like a half cup. Dude was apparently excited by the movie. Stuffing popcorn in his mouth. And choked. The scratch marks around / in his mouth were self-inflicted. Trying to dig out popcorn verified via fingernail scrapings. His was only DNA present. Loud movie. He was in the back. No one saw or heard him choke. I've never eaten popcorn again. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4/5 consecutive autopsies. One of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the ER probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites fluid in the abdomen. So at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighed more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2 to 3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 g each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning. But then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. They popped like airballs, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard. But I think I will remember forever this one. in particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture but I can't find it anymore. P.S. I'm sorry for any mistake.